Hi, this is Kathy from Gadget Stop 321, and in today's video, I'm going to be taking a look at 3 Oysters Doldam. I'll be doing writing samples on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper using a variety of pens and nib sizes. I'll also take a look at writing samples that I did earlier on other types of paper. I'll compare 3 Oysters Doldam to similar inks from my collection. And finally, I'll take a look at the results of my water resistance test. Doldam came off the nib of my glass dip pen very precisely and put down very nice crisp lines, very uniform. It was very pleasant to write with. The swatch that I made with my tweezers was nice and crisp on this Tomoe River paper, but on some of the other papers, it had a little trouble holding on to the paper. The drip at the end of the swatch has a dark halo, but I'm not seeing any sheen, and I didn't see any sheen in any other of the bits of writing. Just a note, the color of the swatch did range from a darker gray with some hints of brown to a lighter gray. I'm going to begin with a Pilot Kakuno. It has an extra fine stainless steel nib. The line put down by this extra fine nib felt nice and smooth on this Tomoe River paper, but the same can't be said for other papers that I wrote on, and I'll talk about that later. The line is nice and crisp, but just because of the lightness of this ink when it's less of it is being put down, for me, the legibility isn't very high. Next, I'll be writing with a Leonardo Momento Zero. It also has an extra fine stainless steel nib, but this time it's a number 6 size Yovo. The nib with this ink on this paper felt glassy smooth, and to me, it wasn't in a pleasant way. It felt too smooth, almost like it was too dry, if that makes sense. You can see there's not a lot of ink being put down, and again, it's a wider line, but to me, still the lightness of it, there's not quite enough legibility for my taste, but that's just a matter of personal preference. Next, I'll be writing with a Pilot Custom 74. It has a 14 karat fine nib. Look how dry that upstroke was. That's a characteristic of this nib, and I feel like you can really feel it with this ink. This ink, because it has such low saturation, it feels really watery, and it doesn't provide much lubrication between the nib and the paper, so it feels drier than normal, but fortunately, these Pilot Fine nibs tend to be pretty smooth, so to me, this felt very pleasant. I wouldn't call it smooth, but it was just pleasant. Next, I'll be writing with a Sailor Pro Gear Slim Mini. It has a 14 karat medium fine nib. Okay, sorry I missed that writing sample. I had to tend to my cat and forgot to turn the camera back on. But I said that this Sailor Pro Gear Slim with a medium fine nib felt pretty smooth overall on this smooth Tomoe River paper. There was still just a hint of that typical Sailor feedback, but considering how dry a lot of the nibs feel with this low saturation ink, this one wasn't bad. My only complaint that I had is that it's so much lighter than the Custom 74. I prefer the look that darker shade of the wetter Custom 74, but again, that's just a personal preference. Next, I'll be writing with a Platinum 3776. It has a 14 karat medium nib. Similar to the Sailor medium fine nib, this medium nib is just a hair drier than that Pilot gold nib. I was going to say that this looks a little too light for my taste. This does look a little bit lighter than the Pilot, but it felt pleasant on this smooth paper. Now, other papers that I've tried, that wasn't the case, but on a nice smooth paper, this feedbacky nib feels pleasant. It does feel a little drier than normal, but it's not really dry. It's just because the ink is not as viscous as some inks that I've tried. Next, I'll be writing with a Pilot Grants. It has a 14 karat medium nib. This was the pen I was most excited about using with this ink. I don't know if it will show up. This has a marble, blackish brown, grayish finish to it, which really looks nice with this ink. For my style of writing, I write pretty small. This is a little bit on the wet side, especially for these small Hobonichi grids, but on a paper with some larger ruling, I think I would really enjoy this. Now on this smooth paper, this does feel pretty glassy smooth, just being this medium nib being just enough wider than this fine nib that it really feels smooth. I tend to prefer just the slight amount of feedback I was getting with the fine nib. Next, I'll be writing with my Kaweco Lilliput. It has a stainless steel broad nib. This nib and ink combination on most of the writing samples that I did had kind of a chalky feeling to them. I have a feeling it's because of the low viscosity of this ink, or what feels like low viscosity, I'm feeling that nib slit kind of scratching across the paper. Well, even in the up direction, I feel a little chalkiness, but it's very pleasant. This has been one of my favorite nibs to write with using this ink. The only thing is, in my everyday writing, this isn't a nib size that I write with very often. My favorite nib size tends to be like the Pilot Fine, the Sailor Medium Fine, and the Platinum Medium. That's my comfort zone right there. And finally, I'll be writing with my Jinhao X750. It has a 1.5 stainless steel stub nib. This nib on this smooth paper and other smooth papers that I've written on feels glassy smooth, but in a dry sort of way. Even though it's not dry, you see that, you know, it's putting down a little bit of ink here, but it just feels dry. And again, I suspect that that's because this ink isn't very viscous. Not typically my favorite feeling, but on some of the other papers, it was just as fun to write with as this Kaweco broad nib. All right, while that dries, let's take a look at some of the other papers. On my Rhodia ice paper, you see that the glass dip pen put down a nice uniform line. This was very fun to play with using the glass dip pen. I had trouble though with my tweezers, not necessarily getting the ink to hold on to the paper. It was more like the paper was pulling all the ink out all at once, and then I had to re-dip it and try again. I had to re-dip it 3 times, and then you can see it pulled all the ink out, and then it did have trouble holding on to the paper here at the very end. I kind of had to tap it on the paper to get it to make the little drip that it usually makes naturally. Now, the stub nib felt dry and slippery, just like on the Tomoe River paper. The Kaweco felt chalky, that broad nib, but in a pleasant way. My Pilot Grants, just like on the Tomoe River, felt a little dry, but in a pleasant way. Even though it wasn't dry, it was putting down plenty of ink. The Platinum felt dry, but in kind of an unpleasant kind of way. I feel like I would get tired of writing with it if I had to do a lot of writing. Same thing with the Pro Gear Slim Mini. The Platinum felt dry, or the Pilot Custom 74 felt dry, but in a pleasant kind of way. I enjoyed it. The Leonardo Momento Zero felt dry because it was dry, and the Kakuno felt dry. You can see how kind of really thin that line is. But on these last two, the ones that felt dry in an unpleasant kind of way, maybe even on these up here, I feel like the smaller you write, the less that becomes a factor. All right, on my copy paper, I normally start this description with the disclaimer that I don't really like most inks on copy paper, but these two broader nibs, I kind of enjoyed them, and I'm not really seeing hardly any feathering or spreading of any nature, so this is very unusual. These two were very pleasant. The rest of them, like the Pilot Grants and the Platinum and the Pro Gear Slim, they felt, nice enough. And the two at the end here, a lot of times the drier nibs tend to be my favorites on this copy paper, but they just, the Kakuno felt a little too scratchy, and the Custom 74 felt dry, this time in a not as pleasant kind of way. But the ones with the smiley faces were pleasant enough to use on this paper. Not really any bleed through to speak of, just a couple of dots. Now this is pretty heavy copy paper, but normally I do get at least a little bit of bleed through. The ink from my collection that was most similar to 3 Oysters Doldam was Graphon Faber-Castell Stone Gray. They both have that little hint of brown to them, though Doldam is even a little beyond a little hint. It's got a lot of brown to it. The inks from my collection that I consider to be more of a true gray are Noodler's Lexington Gray and Pilot Iroshizuku Kirasame, and you can see that they're a little bit lighter in the swatch, and I don't have pen writing for these, but in the dip pen writing samples, there's not as much difference as you see in the swatches. Now, the first thing I thought of when I first started writing with Doldam was Earl Grey, and my lighting is not the best here right now, but Earl Grey is a bit cooler. It looks almost more purpley in this writing sample. And these other inks, like the Pelican Moonstone and the Mont Blanc Oyster Gray. All of these inks have that interesting character to them. You see more than one color component in them. I mentioned earlier that I was excited about using my Pilot Grants, the one with the marble finish, with this ink. Another ink that I enjoyed using with this pen was Mont Blanc Swan Illusion. And Swan Illusion and Monteverde Moonstone have that similar kind of not super saturated brown to them. And Three Oysters Doldam has a lot of that brown in it, but also has the gray as well. You can see that these two inks had a little bit of trouble holding on to the paper, though I've found them to be fairly pleasant to write with. I did writing samples with each of the pens on a little piece of rhodia paper, let it dry for a bit, and then submerged it in water for 10 minutes. And interestingly, it left the brown behind, and the gray is what came up. A lot of times with many of my favorite inks have that gray component that is left behind, but to my surprise, that was the component that lifted off the paper. And look how legible and crisp this is. A lot of times that leftover component will be blown out a bit, but this is very crisp, very interesting. And now back to the Tomoe River paper. This is a very nice looking gray ink. It's got a lot of character. To me, gray inks are very difficult to pull off because if they're too dark, they just look like watered down black ink. And if they're too pale, the legibility is just not there. Now, for my comfort zone, I mentioned I prefer the fine to medium Japanese nibs. This worked really well, especially if you're going to be using nice smooth paper. No bleed through, of course. It didn't hardly bleed through on the poor quality paper, and with this being a lighter ink, there's less show through. This was an interesting ink. I would classify this as one of those that kind of depends on what pen and nib size and paper you're going to be using, but there are a lot of options that work really well. And fortunately for me, my favorite nib sizes tend to work pretty well with this ink. If you found this video helpful, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more videos like this, please subscribe to my channel.